I've been with AACRAO since 2012, and my first, I guess 5 years ago, watching public policy stuff in Washington. There wasn't a lot. I mean, it looks like there's action going on around higher ed, but there really wasn't a lot of movement. I think there were only 2 bills that passed over that time. But I can tell you now, things are moving very, very quickly in Washington. So I want to give you a bit of an update on what's going on, see if we can make a little bit of sense of this. I'll give you a few higher ed updates, things from AACRAO. But we'll be talking about some of our federal relations updates, some of the stuff that we're doing in the DC office, the Higher Ed Act reauthorization, the federal budget update. Today, as many of you maybe saw, the President released his budget for the next year, which is interesting, and a bit of a legislative update and some trending topics. First, just a reminder, I hope we'll see some of you at the annual meeting, which is coming up next month, fairly close. But if you have attended our technology and transfer meeting, it's the second week of July in Minneapolis, and then our SEM conference is going to be in Washington, D.C. And it's going to be over Veterans Day, so we hope to do a little bit of a focus on some activities serving veterans, get some people to come in and talk about work that's going on in D.C. So let's talk a little bit about the federal relations. One thing that we did, the board reconstituted our former PPAC, our Public Policy Advisory Group. I guess it's been more than a year, not quite 2 years ago. And the chair of that group is Tim Amex. Where's Tim? Tim, thank you for your work on that. He actually was on the previous group, so it's providing us a little bit of continuity. And we did this as a call out to the membership like we're prone to do, and got quite a few good volunteers, and these folks will be serving us for 3 years. And their job is really to give us practitioner advice on various things that come up. For example, just this Friday, we have a meeting, a telephone conference call with the Government Accountability Office. They're asking us about the use of Social Security numbers in admissions and records at colleges and campuses. And if I read the questions, it looks to me like the government's thinking about getting away from the paper Social Security card, because there's a lot of questions about whether you ask for it and whether you use it. So we'll be able to provide our perspective from members of our profession about how the social number is used or not used. But they're doing some great work for us, so thank you. One other thing that we did, we're almost a year now having hired a new Director of Government Relations, William Gill. And Bill came to us from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute and worked many years with HACU, the Association of Hispanic Colleges and Universities, and has a real good sense of the Hill. We have put together an advocacy center. It's a product that we're using that allows you to more easily put letters in on issues of impact to our members. So for example, right now we have 2 calls to action that allow you to facilitate pretty easy letters. One is about the PROSPER Act, and you'll hear much more about it. That's the House's bill about reauthorization for Higher Ed Act. And we're doing one about Dreamers, because you may have noticed there's some discussion in our country about immigration, and certainly the Dreamers are a big part of that. So was anybody on a conference call from one of the other state and regionals this last week about the use of this product? It is in our advocacy center, and you can use it. Go in and look at this. We're also hoping to be able to do this at state level. It's a pretty neat product that you can craft some letters that are more attuned to you, and then we can set it up on our service, and you can get your members to shoot out letters really quickly. We've had some good responses so far. So the HEA. Now many of you know the HEA was passed in 1964. It's been reauthorized 8 times. The last time it was introduced in one session, and I think it was finally reauthorized about 5 years later. I think we may be on that trajectory because there's a lot of things going on. For the first time in a while, the House has gotten engaged. We've always seen the Senate involved in the Higher Ed Act. And over the last couple of years, you've seen the Senate talking about doing a draft of a higher ed reauthorization. But the House was really dropping individual bills. But Representative Fox, who is the chair of this, has now drafted a House version of the higher ed reauthorization, and it's called the PROSPER Act. So it came out of committee on December 12th. In that bill is the reverse transfer bill. And that is a bill that's been advocated by AACRAO. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but they didn't have a lot of amendments get into the draft of the bill, but ours managed to get in there in sort of a circuitous process. The full House is expected to consider this bill as early as this month. Now, one thing, we'll see how they do that, because the bill has gotten quite a bit of pushback from the higher ed community. We've chimed in on this. Again, we've got a call to action because there's a lot of things in it that are not very student friendly. And they're starting to hear a bunch of this, and I think they're a little bit worried about putting a vote in the House where there's a big cut to student financial aid. And we're coming up on an election season, and it's not a really good position to take, particularly if it never materializes because the Senate comes up with a bill where that's not going to be in it. So to go on record in favor of cutting financial aid, some people are worried is not going to be a great thing. Now, we had thought this was going to move through, one version of the bill is going to move through pretty quickly. I've seen people speculate now that we're not going to get a reauthorization to probably 2020. Barmac Nasserian, if you see his blog, had mentioned a kind of a similar timetable. So that wouldn't surprise me. We've got immigration, we've got an infrastructure discussion going on, we've got lots of all the spending bills that have to take place, even though we had a budget last week. There's now 12 appropriation bills that have to get passed. We haven't passed appropriation bills in the United States in probably 5 years. I mean, we've been running on these continuing budget resolutions and just keep, as they say, kicking the can down the road. So there's a lot going on. So whether this bill is going to get much traction in the near term, it's hard to say. But let's look at what some of the things are that are within this bill. And AACRAO has tried to dive into this in pretty much as much detail as we can. And there's some things in there we really like. You know, for one, FAFSA simplification is in there. Those of you from this great state of Tennessee, your senator loves to take the copy of the FAFSA. Have you ever seen him unfurl it and show all the 125 questions in all their glory? He first suggested bringing it down to, I think, 2 or 3 questions, which I think people kind of push back a little bit. But there is definitely interest in doing a FAFSA simplification and creating what they call a consumer-tested, mobile-friendly application form. So that's in the bill, and we like that. Prior year, which many of us have implemented, or we've all implemented, this last year is probably going to get codified. They're suggesting to codify that language in the bill. The bill would remove loan origination fees. We can support that. And for the first time, the bill would give campuses more flexibility to limit loan amounts to certain students. Right now, one of the problems is, they want you to be accountable for all the debt of your students, but you don't have a lot of control over how much they can borrow. So there will be some language in there to allow you to do that. Don't know what that's going to look like, but I know financial aid administrators have asked for that. Now, some concerns. They're overhauling financial aid in a big way. They would end up with 1 grant, 1 loan, 1 work-study bill, or program. So really streamlining. And again, that's a lot of Senator Alexander's belief on the Senate side. The bill calls for the termination of the federal direct loan program. So we cut that out. Perkins loan program. We've been fighting to keep this bill alive. This bill would call for a wind down of the program, as well as rescinding any loan cancellation for teachers. So not something we could be supportive of. And then the income-based repayment side, the bill would streamline all federal income-based repayment programs into 1 program. But it would eliminate some of the programs and just make it more difficult for some people to get loan repayment. And the changes for return to Title IV, some changes there, this is where I think they're getting into this skin in the game, where there's going to be some penalties for institutions in terms of how many students they're having to return Title VIII for lack of completion. So that's one that we're watching pretty closely as well. Okay, on the student assistance side, there is a new work-study formula that the House has proposed, and it would remove the community service requirement and the private sector employment caps, providing some more flexibility to institutions to do work-study. It would also nearly double the recent appropriations to the program to $1.72 billion. So positive. On the Pell Plus, the bill reauthorizes the Pell program until 2024 and provides Pell Grant bonuses to incentivize completion. And we don't know what all the details are for that, but that's some creative use of the Pell Grant. In the apprenticeship arena, the bill expands student access to industry-led programs that lead to high-wage, high-skill, high-demand careers. A lot of interest in apprenticeships and career-type programs, and so there's some good support in there. Now, on the concern side, work-study eligibility. Graduate students would no longer be eligible for work-study under this bill. Graduate students don't have a lot of sources of financial aid as it is, and so work-study would be no longer available. And despite the increase in the cap, the funding, if you look in their formula, the funding at the institutional level for many colleges and universities would actually decline. Pell Grants, the bill would cut off Pell eligibility after 3 payment periods with no credit. That's a new cap. It would also mandate annual student loan and Pell Grant counseling without providing any resources or support for you to do that job. And TRIO funding cuts, some significant cuts to the program and requiring matching funds, not a way to expand access and opportunity for students, and the elimination of the SEOG grant. I mentioned there's a lot of details in these bills, and this is just the House version. We're going to see a Senate at some point. A lot of discussions about program integrity. Some of the accreditation provisions in the bill would provide statutory authority to the accreditor to use a risk-based or differentiated accrediting procedures. That's new. If you think about it, every institution basically has to have the same full-blown accreditation process, where it's pretty clear that there are institutions that are far less risk because of their history and performance than others. But they've never really been able to bring that into the formula. That's now part of this bill. The bill would maintain the requirement that schools be authorized by each state in which they have a physical location. That's been there for a while. Now on the other side, the bill would strike 10 standards in current law for accreditation and replace them with one student outcome standard. And I don't know that higher ed is that uniform to be able to apply one thing about student outcomes, so that's problematic. State authorization, now this one's a little complicated. The bill would repeal the 2010 and the 2016 regulations. That includes repealing the requirement that institutions that provide distance programs be authorized in each state. Now that has been a problematic proposal, particularly when they haven't really defined what that means. Is that, offering one class? Are we talking about programs? Are you going to allow reciprocity agreements to do this? So, we've been kind of generally supportive of the notion that there should be some quality controls around people doing distance education. We didn't necessarily like the way they proposed it before. It looks like they will keep the reciprocity agreements in there, so that makes it a little bit easier, but we're watching this pretty closely. Now, the other things that are in there about program integrity, these have been a little bit more visual. They would eliminate the gainful employment requirements, and they would eliminate the 90-10 rules. Now, if you're not familiar with all those, gainful employment has been in the original Higher Ed Act of 1964 that said you need to have a gainful employment in a recognized degree. They haven't really defined that. Well, they tried to define it during the Obama administration, and getting a lot of pushback, particularly from for-profit schools. They're in negotiated rulemaking about it, but this bill would just eliminate that. The 90-10 rule, requiring that you have at least 10% of your resources come from outside federal financial aid. They would eliminate that. Now, AACRAO has been a pretty strong supporter of this. When I get to the Senate side, they're talking about this issue as well, but we still stand pretty firmly behind the fact that there needs to be a demonstration of quality and commitment beyond simply just running an institution exclusively off of financial aid. So that's been our position. So that will be an interesting one, and it's going to get picked up in the Senate too. In this bill, competency-based education, the bill would create a pathway to better align competency-based education programs with Title IX aid programs. So that's been a problem for anybody who's been trying to do innovative things in competency-based education, how you report your enrollments to the Fed about your return to Title IV, your satisfactory academic progress, all of those kinds of issues. This will help with that. We do have some concerns. There's a little bit of a lack of safeguards. This would allow federal aid to be given to non-education providers, meaning some of the innovators that institutions are working with, and just always a little nervous about that as people come into this space. Inside the bill, though, is the reverse transfer bill. So thanks to lots of folks in here, Tennessee is certainly very supportive of that. The reverse transfer bill is something that we've been working on quite a bit. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the future, but it's in there. Let's see, I'll go to the next one. Now, last week, there was a Congressional Budget Office scoring. If you recall, if you're not familiar with the CBO scoring, it was really prominent when they were trying to repeal Obamacare. You remember when all the CBO scores were coming out to talk about how much it's going to cost, how many people are going to lose insurance, et cetera. So the CBO scores all of these bills, and they score that this bill would reduce federal student aid funding by $14.6 billion and spending on federal student loan programs by $26.3 billion over 10 years. That's the big issue. I mean, this is not a student-centered bill. So that's a big part of our advocacy center proposal is to, I mean, you can talk about the good things in this bill, but this is unacceptable. So we're going to push back pretty hard on this. So the Senate. You know, the Senate, where this works is in the Help Committee, and the chair of that committee is the good senator from Tennessee, Senator Alexander. Works very closely with the Democratic Senator Patty Murray from Washington. They've been working collaboratively for several years now, so we'll probably see a little bit more collaborative approach. There was not a lot of Democrat input on the House bill. I'd say probably none. But in the Senate, Senator Alexander is, I think, doing a very good effort to try and be bipartisan about this. Although he did issue a white paper last week that didn't have any Democratic input. The Democrats responded with their own memo. I think this is going to be the pattern of these competing memos. You saw the Nunez memo maybe started it, that we'll have a Republican memo and then a Democratic memo, and eventually, hopefully, we'll have a joint memos. But until then, we're going to have these competing ones. That's right. So they have held 4 hearings since January in the Help Committee. So they're really gearing up for this. And Leroy Rooker and Bill Gill and I met with the Help staff about 2 weeks ago, primarily to talk about our reverse transfer bill. But they did tell us they expect to release a draft, a mock-up of the bill in April before Easter. So we'll see if that actually helps. The senator released a white paper, which, you know, if you're policy junkies like I am, it's not a bad read. In fact, it was in the Inside Higher Ed did a piece on it, I think February 2nd. And in this white paper, he had released one 2 years ago that talked about a number of things, including whether we needed a student record database, a unit record database. But in this piece, he's primarily looking at accountability. And the 3 topics that he deals with are the issue of really focusing on cohort default rates as one of the metrics of whether your institutions are successful. So a white paper about the history of that and what alternatives might be. The 90-10 rule. Now again, we've been supportive of, we'd like to drop it down back to the 85-15 percentage, but he does make a point that if you use this rule just very strictly and didn't apply it not just to for-profits, but did it to public institutions, about 80% of community colleges and about 40% of public universities would also fail the 90-10 test. Because they argue it's more a measure of how many low-income students you have than financial support for the program. So that's an interesting point. I'll give him that point. But they do still acknowledge there has to be some kind of metric to be able to say that there's more of a commitment to the institution, that it's not simply running on financial aid. And the third one was the gainful employment rule. So it looks like in the Senate side, you'll see those 3 issues be pretty prominent. About 3 years ago, AACRAO helped ACE on a major report that was led by two presidents, the president of Vanderbilt and the president of the University of Maryland system, about higher ed regulation. And we did a 100-page paper on all the different regulation that higher ed is under. And the senator is using a lot of that. So you'll see a combination of, some things where it might say, oh my God, you're going to get in there and mess with some things we don't like. But at the same time, Senator Alexander is very committed to try and take off burdensome regulations that aren't effective. So I think you're going to see a little bit of a double-edged sword for us. So the federal budget update. You may have seen last week, we had a little shutdown in DC. It didn't last very long. The one before it lasted a few days. This one just lasted a couple of hours. But they came up with an agreement. So there is a $320 billion budget package with stopgap funding through March 23. It includes an additional $4 billion in funding for higher ed over the next 2 years, positive. $89.3 billion in disaster aid for hurricane and wildfire victims, and much of that is going to colleges and universities who have served those students. That last line, it did not have the DACA fix in it. And if you recall, there were quite a few folks that were really pushing to have that as part of the legislation. It did not happen. Now, if you combine with the CBO scoring that they've done for the Higher Ed Act, they also have projected what this is going to do to the deficit and what the tax bill is going to do to the deficit. I think the projections on this budget that they passed last week, it's going to add $1.4 trillion to the deficit. The tax bill added $1.7 trillion. We're already carrying $11 trillion of federal debt. So by the end of this 10-year process, all things being equal, will be at about $14 trillion of federal debt. So one of the interesting things about this is a pretty significant shift, certainly for the Republican Party. Democrats have been a little bit more willing to do the spending, but there's a lot of critics coming out right now about this agreement because it didn't show much constraint on any side of the aisle. Republicans got their funding for the military, and Democrats got a lot of funding for some of their social programs. Again, things that we want, but that combined with cutting $1 trillion of revenue out in the tax bill in December creates some pretty interesting dynamics moving forward. A lot of people think this is going to be unsustainable, that these debts will become an issue at some point, and what's likely going to be on the table to look at our federal entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. So that's something to watch, and of course, higher ed is always part of the discretionary spending, so we could find ourselves caught up in that as well. So, we didn't shut down the government. We've raised the debt ceiling for 2 years, but we've put off a lot of tough decisions, and I think those are going to be heading our way. Now, DACA, if you recall, the Senate agreed to bring up DACA legislation as part of the budget agreement, and that conversation starts today. So over the next 2 weeks, you'll probably see quite a few proposals. You've already seen what Senator McConnell did was he created a shell bill that's sitting there with no content in it. And now they're waiting for proposals. I saw the first one that came up is probably more from the conservative side. So it provides funding for 1.8 million dreamers and a path to citizenship, but it also completely funds the Mexico wall, gets rid of chain migration, gets rid of the visa lottery. That's likely not going to pass. I saw Senator McCain put a bill through last week that is more, I'd say, more moderate side, where there's protection for the dreamers, there's some increase in border support and defense, but not the wall. So it is going to be a really interesting 2 weeks. The speculation is that because it's going to start in the Senate, there's a little bit more moderate viewpoints there. You're probably going to get a bill that protects dreamers, does much more funding for border security, but not the wall, and pass it and see what the House does. Now, the House has always said they're not going to pass a bill, not even going to bring up a bill that doesn't have the president's support. And that's one of the problems. It's not real clear exactly what he'll sign. So I think it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks here. And unfortunately, many of the folks caught in the fulcrum of this are our students. So the president's skinny budget just came out today. He's required to do this by the 1st of February each year. Pretty big cuts to higher ed and education. Cut education department's budget by $68 million, or from $68 million by $9.2 million, so about 13.5%. Cuts the Pell Grant program by $3.9 billion, basically going into sweeping up the surplus, which people were really counting on to use to pay for year-round Pell. So that's not positive. Cuts TRIO and Gear Up programs by $193 million. Abolishes SEOG, significantly reduces federal work study. Now, the thing is, if you recall, last year when the president came out with a very similar budget, Congress kind of ignored it because they're not going to make those kinds of cuts to aid. Federal higher ed financial aid is fairly popular, so I think this might be going nowhere. But you can start to see creeping into this conversation. They're looking at these debts. They're looking at the fact that the debt ceiling got pushed up 4 weeks because we're bringing in less revenue. We're going to start running into these problems where something's going to not balance out. So a couple of legislative things. The Jobs Act, the Tax and Jobs Act that took place in December, there were a lot of things in that, at least proposed, that could have been negative for higher ed. It did overall impose a 1.4% excise tax on investment income at private colleges and university with an enrollment of at least 500 students and assets at $500,000 per student. That's primarily targeting the kind of Ivy League schools. But you may have seen that Senator McConnell did exempt one Kentucky college in the bill recently that was getting close to this. It doubles the standard deduction to $24,000 for joint filers and $12,200 for individuals. That particular thing raises some interest because you'll have far fewer Americans itemizing their deductions. And when you get to the point of itemizing, you're more likely to do gifting and giving. Now, there won't necessarily be an incentive to do that. Let me see, I gotta make sure I've got. Some of these are a little more detailed than I can retain in my head. If you recall in the bill, the drafts of the bill would put tax on tuition waivers for graduate students. We managed to avoid that. There are a lot of things that got avoided, but I will tell you, just on an AACRAO personal note, our association, how the tax bill impacted us. One of the things, when we were purchasing our building space, on the House side of the draft tax bill, they would have prevented 501c3s, which we are, from getting access to tax-free bonds. So we kind of rushed our purchase through in December along with 8 or 9 other entities in the district and got our bonds. But built into these contracts for bonds is a clause that if there's extraordinary changes in federal code, the banks have the right to raise the interest rate, even if you've got a fixed interest rate. And what impacted that was this drop in the corporate tax rate from 39% to 20% has really compressed how much yield they get on tax-free bonds. So we got the phone call and a nice conference call about letting us know that they're going to do what they call a gross up. So our interest rate is going to climb from about 2.77% to just about 3.2%, which, over a 30-year purchase, that's a lot of money. So we've become well acquainted with the tax bill ourselves. So DOC and DREAM Act. So this is also a very complicated issue, of course. The president effectively terminated the program. I guess it terminates March 5th. So we're coming up on that pretty quickly. Congress has to reach a deal to deal with this, and of course there's 800,000 individuals in DACA. They estimate that more like 1.8 million might be eligible for that, despite what the General Kelly says about those folks. I think a lot of people chose not to sign up because they were worried about coming out of the shadows. So at least some of the proposals are talking about addressing all 1.8 million of those individuals, but we'll see. There was also an injunction that was thrown against this from the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco that basically told the Trump administration they couldn't do this. So there have been DACA recipients re-upping over this period of time, and I think they can do it up till March 5th. Now, the Trump administration is doing a very unusual decision. They're not going to challenge the decision in the Ninth Circuit. They took it straight to the Supreme Court. So they've now asked the Supreme Court to enter in on this and determine whether or not they have the legal right to do it. So this is one I just have, it's really hard to know what's going to take place. I mean, it's pretty clear that the majority of Americans and Republican and Democratic leaders want to do something for DACA recipients. The thing is, though, some people want other things in exchange for that, and that's the question, is how much people want to try and get out of this. We've been working closely with Senator Durbin on his bill. So the Reverse Transfer Efficiency Act. What this would do, this is part of the national effort that we have seen around reverse transfer. And we've talked with lots of states and lots of people working on this. And one of the things that kept being brought up to us, Shelby Stanfield was certainly one of the folks that suggested this. One of the challenges that people are having is that right now, if you try to do an outreach campaign to former students who you think might qualify for a reverse transfer, may qualify for an associate's degree, but before you can even get their records and do an evaluation, you have to get their permission. And we're seeing these campaigns are having really low yields, 3 or 4%, and then even within those, when you do the evaluation, you find out the student really doesn't qualify. So what this bill proposes to do is creates an additional exception in FERPA. And I can tell you, we're AACRAO, we're very sensitive about exceptions in FERPA. So we really think, thought this through and think it's a reasonable one, but it would allow institutions to share records back to the previous community college for the purpose of awarding a degree or certificate. And then it would require you to get consent from the student before you provide the degree or certificate. So in a sense, moving the consent down a little bit. There's massive support from this. It was introduced in the House. We got, I think, 6 or 7 Republican sponsors, several Democrats. Interesting process. Luke Messer from Indiana is the main sponsor of this. We're now working on a Senate version of the bill. We think Senator Hatch has talked with his staff and expressed some interest. Interesting process about how we got in the Higher Ed Act bill. So we understand from Representative Fox, the chair of the House committee, she did not want our amendment in the House Higher Ed Act bill because she's going to do a separate FERPA bill, which is actually fine because we have other issues that we want to deal with. So she told her members of the Republicans in our committee not to bring it up. So there was this 12-hour marathon session, 60 various amendments proposed, mostly by Democrats, mostly slapped down. And then Representative Polis, the Democrat from Colorado, raised our amendment. And there was a bunch of skulling, and a bunch of the Republicans said, well, I can't vote against this. I've sponsored this. We had 7 sponsors from the committee. So in order not to have a voice vote on it, they did it by unanimous consent. So we're in the bill. Now, when it goes to the House floor, we'll see whether it stays. It's obviously got to go over to the Senate side. Like I said, we've talked to the Senate Help Committee folks. They think it makes a lot of sense. It's not real controversial. So we think it's going to have some traction. There is a bill to extend the Perkins loan, but I don't know whether that's going to get traction again because Senator Alexander in particular is opposed to this. So I'm not sure whether it's going to move forward. Let's see, there is a bill called the Title IX Protection Act. It would codify parts of the recently rescinded Obama-era guidance on sexual assault. The legislation was rescinded by the Education Secretary. There's interest in bringing some of this back. Again, I don't know whether this has enough bipartisan support, but it may be coming. The Forever GI Bill was passed. We did a lot of work on that bill. And one of the things that was in the bill, and Tim, I think you were pretty involved in this too, was the issue about mandatory priority registration for veterans. You want to mention what transpired there?
So this is actually already in place here in Tennessee, but in what they thought was an act of kindness, they were going to federally mandate that all of our veterans be allowed priority registration. And they thought they were doing a good thing, and then we provided them a laundry list of challenges. And the fact that most people already had something in place, some states already had that in place, and were able to pull it out. But it was one of those things where on the surface it sounded like a really good idea, but there's probably a dozen of you in here going, wow, if that had happened at my campus, it would have been a huge labor-intensive problem. So we're actually pretty happy that we were able to go back and say thank you, but we've got this handled. And by the way, in many cases, our veterans don't want to be called out for special treatment. And so we were able to come to a compromise, and they very happily pulled that out. So it was probably the first win of this iteration of the public policy group.
And where it ended up is it's more of a data collection. It's still in the GI Bill, but they're going to be monitoring issues around priority registration for veterans, but it's not mandated. So that was a good one. So let me see if I can talk about a few trending topics here. So in the courts, there's a couple of things. On Title IX, advocates for sexual assault victims filed a lawsuit in January in the district court seeking to overturn the new campus sexual assault policies issued by Secretary DeVos. So that will, in September they had rolled back the Obama-era guidance. The 2011 letter from the Obama administration declared that schools should use a standard known as preponderance of evidence when judging sexual violence cases. The 2014 question and answer document spelled out school obligations under Title IX. So they've been issuing interim guidelines, et cetera. So this is still in the courts, not resolved. We're seeing bills in the legislature, so I think this is going to be a stay tuned. Displaced students. We've been watching to see, I guess as we've rolled into the new year, if you recall when the hurricanes in New Orleans, there was legislation that allowed students to move to other universities until the institutions were back. We saw some of that from Puerto Rico. It looks like Puerto Rico has recovered, but not completely, and there are still students displaced. So that's an issue we're monitoring. I would put displaced students also under the umbrella of people with temporary visa status. We saw students from El Salvador and Haiti who have been here, some of them for 10 or 12 years under temporary status, recently told now that they have to return to their countries. You may have seen that Syria was exempted from that because as it's pretty well known, the Syrian conflict is very much still going on. So those are some of the issues. AACRAO, by the way, is working on a displaced student issue. We got funding from the Ford Foundation, and we are working with the University of California, Davis, and with the American University of Beirut to build a digital backpack, we're calling it, a place for displaced students to gather and put records of their educational experience, whether they're still in school or graduates, primarily piloting this on Syrian refugees. And a group of us in November spent a week in Lebanon, including several days with meetings with aid agencies from around Lebanon and Beirut, and then we spent 2 days over in the Bekaa Valley visiting Syrian refugee camps. And I have to tell you, from my personal experience, that was very, very powerful. You saw people who are doctors, lawyers, teachers, who have been just immediately displaced, their villages destroyed, they have no hope of going back, and a real fear that they're going to lose a generation of people by not having access to education. So we're really pleased about that work, and that's going to be going on for the next year or so. But this notion of displaced students, there are, the UN Agency on Humanitarian Aid estimates there's something like 5 million displaced students right now in the world. So it's a really big issue for higher ed. How many people know what the GDPR is? And a little bit about that. That is the new European privacy law from the European Union. It goes into effect May. I guess it's coming up in May. I just had to think that through. Much more rigorous guidance for what you do if you're working with European students. Now the question is, who does this apply to? When it first came out, people were thinking, really just institutions if you have a physical location in Europe or if you have programs in Europe. But as we begin to dig into this, it actually could be more than that. I don't know that it necessarily means that you have to apply this to every student from the European Union that's studying at your institutions, but it is a significant change, and it's not the only place where this is happening. We know Canada has passed more rigorous privacy laws. We're seeing some discussions out of Asia. So we've done a couple of webinars. If you want to learn more about this, we do have those webinars archived that you can go in and learn a little bit more about it. We actually have a meeting with a number of European Union folks in April in Paris to try and talk about, what do we do about this? But it's a pretty complicated issue. I think I'll pass on the travel ban, but it's been, the travel ban has been one of those things that's continued to be challenged. One thing that we know that the countries that were recognized in the challenge of the travel ban, if you've seen the number of visas that have been issued, they've significantly dropped. So even if things didn't pass and got put on hold, it had the effect of reducing interest in folks from those countries coming to the United States. The ED guidance on transgender students. Just a little update. The Obama administration had sent out guidance on working with transgender students. The Trump administration rescinded that guidance. AACRAO has been very supportive of trying to find ways to serve all students. So we have started a work group about a year ago who's kind of digging into this issue to find out what the best practices are for students that want to use gender pronouns or other forms of identity, partly targeting the LGBTQ community, but also looking at broader interest of student identity. That work group, we're kind of working on the report right now. I don't know that we'll have at least something to provide at the annual meeting, but that will be coming up soon. I mentioned yesterday that we're going to have a work group coming up in a few weeks on the beyond the box question. If you're not familiar with the beyond the box, that's the term that the Trump administration used a couple of years ago when they issued guidance to institutions encouraging you to think through whether you ask criminal history on your admissions applications. It didn't say ban the box, but it used the term beyond the box, meaning, are you asking the right questions? Are you giving students the opportunity to appeal? Do you have processes in place? Would you consider not asking the questions on your admissions application and putting that issue further down the pipeline so it doesn't impact the decision about admissions? We do know we've been reached out to by Senator Schatz and Senator Durbin, who are interested in codifying that language as legislation. Now again, it's not banning the box, but it's asking beyond the box. Now, folks here in the South, Louisiana has banned the box on the admissions application. Maryland just did it 2 weeks ago. So in Maryland now, you cannot ask the question on your admissions application, but you can do so later in the process, either as part of confirmation or orientation or something like that. So we want to bring a group together to talk about that issue. Plus, we hadn't dealt yet with the question in our disciplinary notations group. What happens when a college or university receives a transcript that has a disciplinary notation on it from the previous institution? What should your practice be? And a lot of schools are asking us, we need help in crafting policies around this. So we're going to be putting a group together to work on that, and we're going to be doing that jointly with NACAC, our colleagues in the admissions side, and we'll be reaching out to NACUA, the National Association of College and University Attorneys, and the Association of the Judicial Officers on campus. It's one of the student affairs groups where you're... AACRAO, thank you, who helped us with the disciplinary notations. We want their membership to be involved in this too. So some big issues on the horizon here. I'll mention one thing too, as I close, going to be happy to answer any questions. I don't have it up here, and it's not necessarily a policy or a legislative thing, but it's just something to put on your radar screen that we're certainly watching, and it's come up a lot. AACRAO is a part of the Washington Higher Education Secretariat. And it's basically all of the executive directors of the major higher ed associations who are in Washington, D.C. come together about every other month. So there's about 40 of us. And one of the things that we've been looking at that we think is a real issue for higher ed is this eroding sense of the value of higher education. I don't know if you've seen some of these surveys from Pew and others, but since about 2008, there's been a serious erosion in the view of the value of education. And there have been some pretty significant political differences too. 10 years ago, Republicans and Democrats were pretty closely aligned in their view of the importance of higher ed. That has really diverged, where there's now a large majority of Republicans who don't view higher ed as positive for the economy. And Democrats have stayed about the same. But it's not just a political divide. They're showing real declines in students age 18 to 24 as well, which is pretty scary. And nobody's served by having fewer people go to college. So I think it's a big issue for higher ed to be working on making a better case for the value of education. I think we've all seen with the erosion of funding at the state level, people start to question a little bit whether or not higher ed is a personal good or a public good. So I think we need to work together because we have institutions in all kinds of states and all kinds of representation in the political level, but it's not positive. So we need to think about what the real benefits of higher education are. And one of the things that people talk about that many times we're not willing to talk about is we like to talk about the value of the liberal arts education, the great citizen, but a lot of people are wanting to come to college for jobs now, and that's a hard thing for some of our institutions to get around to acknowledge that. And I think you're going to start to see more people trying to recognize that, even making the case that your liberal arts education prepares you better to navigate the changing landscape and get jobs. But it's one we've got to do something about it because it's going to become an economic imperative if we see fewer young people choosing to go to college. So, comments, questions? Yes?
So, if you're meeting, from Tulane, the GDPR, if you're meeting in April, does that mean we can't expect guidance from AACRAO and GDPR till April?
Well, I would watch the two webinars. Did you see the webinars?
The first one, but there was no real guidance.
Yeah, I think look at the second one. They got a little closer to guidance, and we're trying to make some determinations. The problem is, I don't think people really know. I mean, NACU has been involved in this quite a bit. It might be a bit of an iterative process that we try to do our best and then watch what the Europeans do in response. I mean, I think right now certainly making sure you have those students identified in your system. But that's the problem with this is they're not even sure exactly who it's going to apply to and what the extent of it's going to be. Yeah, it's not good. Any other questions? I'm here and happy to answer any personally. Thank you very much. Oh, yes.
Mike, I'd like to revisit something that you kind of went past pretty quickly. The legislative action.
Yes.
They previewed this for us in December. And I don't know how many people in here have actually ever written your legislator about something. So a lot of people do, but sometimes it can be a little bit of an intimidating process. And when we talk about it from the perspective of we are representing a public or private institution about an area that's near and dear to us in our jobs, sometimes we have policy or rules at our institutions that prevent us from taking individual action where we would otherwise do so as a private citizen. One of the great things about the Legislative Action Center that AACRAO has set up is that it's completely customizable. And so it ties you directly to your congressperson, okay? So, and then you can go in and represent yourself as a citizen and not as a representative of your institution. For example, as a public institution, I'm not allowed to represent my institution's opinion. That's the job of my president. But this allows you to go in as an individual citizen and represent your opinion. So it's worth taking time. If you don't like the language that AACRAO has drafted for you, then you can edit that to your heart's content. Actually, you probably can edit it to the point that you're actually supporting what
Sure.
that's your call. But it is completely customizable. So where you might think, well, I don't really want to get into that, take a look at this, because it gives you the chance to say in your own words what you want said, but also AACRAO has laid the groundwork for you if you just want to drop your name on something and send it off to the clip.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, like the Prosper Act, you can really focus on the financial aid cuts is the big issue without getting into some of the other things. That we would like to get a pretty resounding set of opposition to cutting the